alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to speak, especially amongst a distinguished panel and speakers such as Professor Salim Youssef. And the task that I've been given is to discuss the current status of cardiovascular disease in Saudi Arabia. Now, in about 10, 15 years ago, this task would have been almost impossible because at that time we did not have much data to discuss. But thankfully, in the last 10, 15 years, we started to have more data to reflect on and to plan upon. However, we still have major gaps in our knowledge, and hopefully the coming few years will bring us more. So first, what I wanted to talk about is the prevalence of coronary artery disease in the general population in Saudi Arabia, acute coronary syndrome, and then I'm going to say a few words about stroke and peripheral arterial disease because really we don't have much data to show you. So let's focus on the prevalence of coronary artery disease in the general population. I think the seminal work in this area has been the work of Professor Mansour al-Nuzha. I'm really not sure, I thought he was going to be around here, but Professor Mansour al-Nuzha led really the groundwork and actually gave us or planned a trial or a registry that actually gave us a lot of information about this area. So in the late 90s, a major cross-sectional study was conducted by him and his group, and multiple papers came out of this, not only discussing coronary artery disease, but the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors, and multiple papers came out on hyperlipidemia, obesity, hypertension, and most recently smoking. And this was probably one of the most important work that was published around the prevalence of diabetes mellitus in Saudi Arabia. So, as I mentioned, the CADIS study is a 5-year national epidemiological health survey regarding coronary artery disease. As I said, it was conducted in the late 1990s, but published in the early 2000s. The target sample was 30 to 70 years, and it was fairly representative in that it obviously contained a fair representation of male and female, but also urban and rural areas. There were 14 administrative regions that were sampled in the study, and it was drawn from the local primary healthcare centers' catchment areas. And in conclusion, it actually included more than 17,000 subjects who went through a rigorous protocol, a questionnaire that looked at the presence of ischemic heart disease, a basic history, and also assessment of symptoms, specifically angina, and quantification or classification according to the WHO criteria, then a physical examination, blood pressure, height, weight, and then a 12-lead ECG, and finally blood samples were collected. So these are one of the most important tables that was presented in the paper. And you can see here, you can see the risk factor prevalences, and probably one of the first papers that actually showed the prevalence, the true prevalence of diabetes in Saudi Arabia was this paper. Almost a quarter of the population sampled had diabetes, but more staggeringly, hypercholesterolemia was found in more than 50% of the population, and there was high rates of hypertension and obesity. So they've also looked at metabolic syndrome, which is an important thing to look at in this population. And it was defined according to the ATP3 guidelines. And the crude prevalence, both in males and females, was over 40%. When they looked at, they stratified the metabolic syndrome according to to age and gender. You can see here that the older the population or the age group, the higher the prevalence, up to 50, 60% had metabolic syndrome. So those are really scary statistics. When they looked at the different regions, urban and rural, you'd expect, as you expect, urban had more metabolic syndrome, but in some regions, you can see that it approaches 50% metabolic syndrome, such as in the Eastern Province. Does anybody know what this is? So this is not a riot. I don't know if it projects well. It's not a riot or a disturbance. This is actually al-Bek, which is the equivalent of McDonald's or KFC, basically, specifically KFC. So all these people are actually waiting in line to get these goodies. So, I mean, the al-Bek and food chains like that actually boomed in the mid-2000s. So the data that I showed you of prevalence of coronary artery, of risk factors, were in the late 1990s, and this stuff came later on. So you could imagine what has happened over the last 10 years in terms of the prevalence of risk factors. So let's talk about coronary artery disease. This is the main objective of the study. And coronary disease was basically defined according to the presence of typical anginal symptoms, according to the WHO criteria, a history of possible MI, and a pathological Q wave and ECG. Really not that rigorous, but that's the best possible way of doing it in a population that big. And here are the numbers. You can see that the overall prevalence of coronary artery disease is about 5.5%. Now, it varies according to the age, male or female, but that is really the overall prevalence of coronary disease, granted, given the diagnostic rigor that was, or the lack of rigor, this number could potentially be higher than what it is. Again, the same expectation. In the urban areas, it's more than 6%, and it's lower, relatively lower in the rural areas. So I talked about the prevalence of coronary disease. Let's focus now and shift gear to talk about acute coronary syndrome. So exciting things has happened over the last 10 years. Multiple registries have been conducted, and a lot of data has been published. So I'm really glad, and especially this work is led by my friend and colleague Khalid Al-Habib, and who has done the groundwork for this. The SPACE registry is a Saudi registry, predominantly Saudis. The Gulf Race 1, it's a Gulf-wide registry. Saudi Arabia was not part of it. But the Gulf Race 2 included Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was a large component of it. And this was followed recently by the Gulf Race 3, the 3 Ps, and which was recently accepted for publication and really addressed or focused on EMS care of STEMI. And currently, the STARS registry, which is a STEMI registry, is a snapshot registry that would inform us more about the incidence of STEMI and give us more representative sample of Saudi Arabia that would address this disease. So the SPACE registry was conducted in the mid-2000s and published in 2011. It involved a large body of investigators from different areas. And this was the meeting conducted in 2006, some time ago. So this registry included more than 5,000 patients, and this was followed later on by the Gulf Race 2, which is a larger registry, almost 8,000 patients, but then again, this is a Gulf-wide registry. And I really don't have time to discuss all the details, but I just chose to highlight certain facts about acute coronary syndrome in our region, specifically in Saudi Arabia. The first thing that I want to share with you is age of presentation of ACS. And you can see here when you compare a SPACE registry, this is the Gulf Race 2, CREATE registry is an Indian ACS registry, GRACE is an international, is a North American registry. You can clearly see here that there's a huge difference in terms of the age of presentation. We present far earlier in Saudi Arabia with ACS compared, for example, to North America. And it's 10 years difference. It is comparable to the Indian patients who present with ACS. You might wonder how come it's even lower in the Gulf Race 2. Gulf Race 2 included a lot of expatriates who are, generally speaking, this age group is a younger age group, so that drove the presentation further down. So that's the first thing. Now, when you look at STEMI versus non-ST ACS, we find that the majority present with non-ST ACS is comparable to the data that was seen in the Gulf Race 2 in the Gulf area, but is completely the opposite to the CREATE registry, which predominantly present with STEMI. This is the second scary slide of this presentation, and you can see here, this is a publication from the SPACE registry. 58% who present with ACS have diabetes mellitus, and by far nobody can beat us in this. There's no other registry that shows this kind of diabetes prevalence. I just chose one of our publications from the SPACE, and here I look at renal dysfunction. And as you know, renal dysfunction is a risk factor. And you can see that based on a renal profile at presentation with ACS, 67% have some form of renal dysfunction, suggesting that this is a high-risk group of patients. When we look at hospital mortality, we find that SPACE in-hospital mortality was 3%. It's relatively lower than others, but you have to put into account the fact that it's a younger population presenting with ACS. The STARS registry, as I mentioned, is ongoing right now. We will get more data about STEMI and STEMI care, hopefully very soon, inshallah. So I talked about ACS. I don't have much to talk about in terms of stroke and peripheral arterial disease. In terms of stroke, we only have few data to share with you. And that one community-based study conducted in the early 90s, the Thugba community, and here the crude prevalence of stroke was 186 per 100,000. Again, this is an extremely small sample and probably not representative of what is happening in Saudi Arabia, plus also it was published in the early 1990s. But unfortunately, that is what we have. There's another publication, again, it's a retrospective hospital-based study, whatever worth it is, but it was conducted in the Eastern Province. 500 patients were reviewed, and again, the crude annual incidence was 43.8%. Again, this is in the early 1990s, the best evidence available, and to this point, we still don't have systematic data to shed light on what is happening on the stroke scene. But the thing is, if you look at the age of presentation, again, the same signal is seen here, that it's a younger population. Finally, peripheral arterial disease, again, limited data. My colleague, Dr. Mohammed Al-Imran, who conducted this study, it's a pilot cross-sectional study that was conducted over 6 weeks. And it was a questionnaire and an ABI less than 0.9, and symptoms or past vascular procedures. And here, 470 patients were analyzed. Again, here the same thing, 56 is the mean age, and those are patients who came to the primary care clinics. You can see that prevalence of PAD was 11, almost 12%. Some of them are subclinical. And 92 actually are completely asymptomatic. Again, the same thing, if you look at diabetes, 78% had diabetes amongst those who present with PAD, and risk factors obviously are quite high. So, in conclusions, ladies and gentlemen, there's really no current data on the prevalence of vascular disease in Saudi Arabia. In terms of ACS, we have a lot of data. However, in terms of overall prevalences, incidence of CAD and ACS, we still lack these data. It's a rapidly changing socio-demographic and lifestyle population, and there's a large change in the lifestyle in our population. There's a staggering high prevalence of coronary vascular CVD risk factors. There's a strong signal for early presentation of ACS, possibly even stroke and PAD, and that might even feed more into my talk in the afternoon about risk assessment in the apparently healthy individual. These kind of data are important to consider. And there's an urgent need for mechanism to periodically assess incidence of vascular disease and related mortality. One of the pities really, is that until today, and MOH officials can attest to this, there is no proper coding of death and vascular death. So we really cannot even look at these data from our vital statistics, vital senses. There's also an urgent need for identification of the genesis of CV risk factors. And I think that the PURE study that is led by Professor Salim Yusuf, spearheaded by my colleague Khalid, hopefully will give us more insight into that. Thank you very much for your attention.